We live in an increasingly digital world, and people can use computers to surveil and control others. One site where they do that is money. They can block your transactions, your ability to send or receive value. Bitcoin is a way to fight back. It's a way to resist. And that's why we call Bitcoin resistance money. And we think that the world is better to have resistance money in it than not.
Welcome back to the Zoom Out podcast. I'm your host, Tim Niemeyer. Today I have the special privilege of talking with Andrew Bailey, professor at Yale-NUS, which is National University of Singapore College, professor of philosophy, and also co-author of the book we're going to talk about today, Resistance Money. Andrew, thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Tim. Pleasure to be with you.
Thanks for coming. Now, it's morning time here in the States, and it's nighttime for you in Singapore. I'd like to talk about Singapore a little later. I actually spent some time in there when I was in the Air Force, and it was an amazing experience. But before we get to that, so I've read a lot of philosophy, and not a lot, a good amount of philosophy. I've listened to podcasts on it. Philosophy is just the love of knowledge, right? So as much as I've loved it, I've never thought how you could make a living being a philosopher. Like, I want to understand first, before we get into anything or the book, how do you get to the point where you're saying, I want to do that. I want to be a philosopher. That's going to be my living. Can you take us through that journey?
Sure. Philosophy, as you say, is the love of wisdom. And taken in that classical sense, everybody either is or maybe should be a philosopher. We should all care about and pursue and love wisdom. But there's maybe a narrower set of questions that have come to be associated with that word philosophy. These are abstract questions about what we should do, about what kinds of things exist, about what we can know, about how the whole world fits together, about how we form conclusions on the basis of evidence and piece together a view of the world. And some of us think about those questions here and there, but some of us fixate and we just can't let go. And those are the people who become philosophy professors. And what do we do with our time? Well, we spend time in classrooms with other people who fixate on those questions, and we guide them through conversations. And we read books from other people who have thought about those questions and had arguments and reasons going back and forth for various proposed answers to those kinds of questions, and help them think about it carefully.
You're kind of like a mental Sherpa, if you will, like almost a lot of people who get into weightlifting or bodybuilding, they have a personal trainer. So you're basically like a personal trainer for developing the mind is what you're getting at.
Tim, some of the students I've been closest with over the years, you know what they call me? Coach.
What's that?
And
I dig that.
That's why. I don't think my goal is being the guru who says what's what. Instead, I'm there to ask questions, and we journey together and we try to understand things together. And of course, I have ideas of my own that I write down arguments and write books and papers. But honestly, even in those cases, I'm most excited about helping other people think too and pursue their own answers to the questions that have driven me crazy.
I love that. And that's kind of the way it should be, is like we should all, life is a journey. And as long as you're in that mindset of everything is a learning opportunity, you know, that's kind of like, to me, that's kind of the goal of a happy life is like, are you getting better and are you having fun doing it? It's that balance between those two. If it's too much of one or the other, then it's not going to work out. But that's pretty amazing. So you've had this feeling for a long while. How did that get you to Singapore?
I went to graduate school at the University of Notre Dame and finished up a PhD in philosophy. And then I was a postdoc and spent a couple of years in the job market. And that just means looking for people who want to hire philosophers and applying to those jobs. And there was a job in Singapore. And my best friend in grad school, who I had lived with for 4 years, had grown up for some of his childhood in Singapore. And so he told me, oh, you should apply for that job in Singapore. It's actually a pretty good place to live. Don't worry about what you've heard. It's quite good. And this man is, in fact, one of my co-authors in the Bitcoin book. He comes into the story later. He was the person who also told me to get into Bitcoin. So not only do I owe Brad Rettler for sending me to Singapore, I also owe him for getting me into Bitcoin. So he said, go to Singapore. I was offered the job. And here I am 12 years later, and built a life here teaching philosophy and eventually teaching philosophical topics that are adjacent to Bitcoin, money, and economics and politics.
I love that. So I was in the Air Force 25 years ago or something, and I was stationed in Japan for 2 years, and we did one short tour for training, and I spent a month in Singapore, and it was one of the best experiences I've ever had. It's an interesting country. Interesting country. It's like the rules, it's very free, but some of the rules, like for example, just to throw out extremes, like I don't know if it's still this way, but like prostitution was legal, but yet you couldn't spit gum on the side of the road or you get arrested. That's kind of
right.
So from a philosopher's standpoint, you got that. I'd love to hear your take on Singapore and their rule set. Like, it seems pretty free. Is that your take on it? It's one of the most free nations?
It's complicated. Political categories here are a little bit different than they are in the United States. So simply talking about one dimension, freedom, might not be the best way to understand what's going on here.
Okay.
One category that might be useful is to say Singapore is a democracy, but it's not a liberal democracy in the way that Western Europe or the United States is. It has different social mores and different expectations for behavior in public. And in some ways more free, in some ways less free. But it's still unquestionably a democracy in the sense that there are free and fair elections. And people choose in those elections to have leaders who are a little bit authoritarian when it comes to things like spitting gum, as you say.
Sure.
On the other hand, on a good year in Singapore, there are only a few or even zero murders a year in a city of 5 to 6 million. And violent crime is virtually unheard of. So there are trade-offs, of course.
Yeah.
I've thoughts about all of that, as you might guess, but
sure.
I've lived here for 12 years. So maybe that tells you something about my thoughts. I accept the trade-offs here.
Well, and I feel like we're going to get into this a little later, but even from just the conversation so far, philosophy, that from reading the book we're going to talk about, Resistance Money, you have to be willing to pause and think about almost every word you're using. Like I found myself reading, and this is a compliment. This is not a dig at all. As I was reading, you read a book and you just kind of usually read and you're thinking about your thoughts and you're reading. But this one, it was like, as I'm reading, pausing, and I'm thinking to myself, do I know what I'm talking about? When I use this word, do I know what I'm talking about? And that's kind of I think just true for philosophy in general. So where I'd like to pivot to is Bitcoin. Where in this journey did you start to even get your first, second, third touch point? Where did you start to get into this?
My first touch point to Bitcoin was just my buddy Brad from grad school telling me, okay, you need to buy some. So I did as I was instructed and I bought some and just held on to it and thought about it and started to think about it more as it started to become more valuable, but also more interesting. And we talked about it and we talked about it more. And perhaps in parallel to this, my own teaching started pivoting more from the more abstract topics in philosophy to the applied ones that my students were most interested in. And those were often concerning money, perhaps unsurprisingly. Money has a way of capturing people's minds and hearts. We think about it a lot. And my students
touches everything.
Who were, yes, it touches us all. It's hard not to think about. So I taught this interdisciplinary class on money in 2017 and included a unit on Bitcoin then. And it started to expand and expand that little unit and gradually took over and became a mini class of its own, and now a full class that I teach on the philosophy and economics of Bitcoin. And alongside that development and teaching, my friendship with Brad and Craig continued to grow. Craig, our co-author in this book, and we started to think about this more seriously as a writing project. And so the research side of this grew in parallel and sometimes complementing the teaching side, thinking about this stuff deeply, talking about it with students, and then talking about it with my colleagues, and finally starting to write more and more. And it starts with an article, then becomes a longer article, and then eventually we look at each other and like, okay, we've already written 20,000 words. Let's turn this into a book. 80,000 more to go.
When was the first article? What year were we in when this started?
The first published piece was October or November of 2020, called Why Bitcoin Needs Philosophy. We'd been thinking about it for quite a bit before that, but that was a piece we published with CoinDesk. And then a long series, is a 2-part series of survey articles for a philosophy journal called Philosophy Compass on the philosophy, politics, and economics of cryptocurrency. That came out the next year in 2021. And we had like 300 sources for that one. We did tons of research. And that's when it became clear that this was a topic that really deserved to be a book and not just a couple of articles here or there.
My question that I'm going to ask is not political at all, but did COVID, or the response to COVID, did that add fuel to the fire or help you focus? Was it a more, I have all this time to think now, or?
Oh, no. It sharpened our focus perhaps in 2 ways. First, by seeing the distressing rise of authoritarian responses to COVID. And I don't say that as someone, I was vaccinated, for example. I'm a pretty normie guy in terms of how I responded and how I behaved personally. But I was disturbed sometimes by the authoritarian responses that I saw in response to COVID. And second, the way the monetary system responded with insta stimulus, money printer go burr, made us start asking deeper questions about that too. So those 2 things in parallel, which begin in March 13th, 2020, somewhere around there, up through April, those 30 days were days in which the 3 of us learned a lot about the world and came to see that Bitcoin has a deep and important role to play here beyond what we knew.
Absolutely. And I had a similar journey because I started and I had my shitcoining days in 2018 and was learning about Bitcoin and decentralization. And I thought everything was decentralized at that point, but it was right around that March 2020 where, like you said, it really focuses. And I love how you point out authoritarianism. I tend to think the same way, that there's not so much left or right. It's authoritarian. It's a not just a one kind of spectrum that we're dealing with, left or right. And I feel so many people only see that, and they don't see the other part of that, the other axis, I guess you will, the authoritarian versus freedom and liberty.
Yeah, agreed.
So here we are, resistance money. I love this, and like I said earlier, I love it because it forces me to think.
Well,
there are many books. There are many books that did that for me. Like early in my journey, the Bitcoin Standard, Price of Tomorrow. I read those 2 books back to back, and it's just kind of paradigm shattering. Like what you think. And now in my journey, I've been in 6 years, and I was looking initially at the book, and I was looking at the topics and everything, and I was telling myself, like, I'm just full of myself, I guess. I know about that. Oh, I know about how transactions work, or I know about how Bitcoin's ledger, the decentralization. But back to what I was saying earlier, like the definitions of words mean so much. So as I was reading this book, I just find myself pausing and saying, do I really know what I think I know? It's like I have a very cursory understanding as I read. So as we get into this, I hope everybody not only gets the book, takes the time, because it's so worth the journey. And what I'd like to do,
thank you.
If I may, yeah, absolutely. If I may, I'd like to read that first paragraph, that first section, because it really just sets the stage.
We're fond of that paragraph, and we spent hours and hours and hours for every single word on that front page. So Tim, it would be I would love to hear you read it, because we spent a lot of time fighting over that.
Well, I'll try my best here. So 1.1, welcome to Bitcoin. Here we go. This is just a great intro. Bitcoin is for criminals. It's a tool for terrorists, drug dealers, and hackers, and a plaything for degenerate speculators. Bitcoin is for protesters. It's a tool for Alexei Navalny, thank you, and other Russian dissidents. It's for Roya Mahbub and women under patriarchal rule. It's for underbanked Black Americans, North Koreans, and Ukrainian refugees, Venezuelan farmers suffering under hyperinflation, and whistleblowers like Julian Assange and Edward Snowden. Bitcoin is resistance money. Now, I could keep going, but like right off the bat, you set the stage. And the thing that, as I kept reading that introduction, it takes me back to the old adage, I guess you could say, that like, think of a hammer. A hammer can be used for construction to build things, and a hammer can be used for violence. Is a hammer good? Is a hammer bad? And along the philosophical line, that's the question. And it's not that there is a right or wrong answer, but that's the question that you guys are just laying down. So right from there, I want to leave it at that. Where do you go with that? Where do you?
I'm glad that you drew the connection to hammers, Tim, because that's close to the heart of our view, which is that Bitcoin is a tool that can be used for many things. And we think the world is better for having that tool in it rather than not. But we think it's important to acknowledge that tools, especially the multi-purpose and the most interesting tools, have both good and bad uses. And if Bitcoin couldn't be used for crime, then it couldn't be used for whistleblowers either. Because notice that whistleblowers are often criminals themselves. Some criminals are good. Martin Luther King Jr. was a convicted criminal. He went to jail. Some criminals are bad. Jeffrey Dahmer was a criminal. He also went to jail. Alexei Navalny was a criminal. He died in prison. He suffered for his resistance to Putin's authoritarianism. So we think it's actually a sign that Bitcoin is one of these most interesting and powerful tools that's multi-purpose, precisely because it is used by criminals of both the good and bad kind. So that's actually evidence, we think, of our thesis when we see Bitcoin being used for nefarious purposes, in addition to the good ones that the proponents of Bitcoin are eager to cite.
So I'm going to throw out a word that's probably loaded, but that made me think of the phrase legal doesn't mean moral. So if I throw it at you, is Bitcoin moral?
I'm not sure how to answer that question because I think of actions that people do as being the things that are moral or immoral. And you can do moral and immoral things with Bitcoin.
It's not the hammer's fault.
That's right. That's right. But we can still evaluate the hammer and we can still say, is it good for there to be a world with a hammer or without? And the fundamental question of the book is whether we would want to live in a world with Bitcoin or without. And we try to give evidence across the chapters that follow that one would want to live in a world with Bitcoin rather than without, despite its drawbacks.
So can you give me an example, maybe something that you wrote or that's near and dear to your heart that would help describe why you think? I believe it's a world we should be in a world with Bitcoin. Give us a taste of what your thoughts are on that.
Let me give an abstract and then maybe a concrete version of it. Actually, let me start with the concrete. Perhaps we can turn to the story of Roya Mahbub, which you mentioned her name. She's in that first paragraph. So she was a software engineer in Afghanistan who ran a company in, let's say, 2010 through 2015 in Afghanistan, sometime around that. 2013 was when she was most active and still living in Afghanistan. And the software engineers she employed were mostly women. And she was being paid by overseas clients to do various coding projects. And they wanted to pay with digital money. But if they paid with dollars or with dollars that were converted to local currency, what happened to the women who worked for Roya? Their money was taken from them by their husbands. And they weren't permitted by law or by social custom to have bank accounts of their own or to have independence financially from their own husbands. So this is a very bad situation, and Bitcoin proved to be salvation in two ways. First, it allowed Roya to get payments from overseas. Second, to give to her employees. And in fact, some of them escaped from abusive family situations, moved to Europe, and took the Bitcoin with them. You can't do that with a bank balance in your husband's name, and it's very hard to do that with gold or with cash, because those things too can be taken from you by an abusive husband when you're trying to leave the home. So there's a concrete story of how Bitcoin can literally be salvation for someone. Now, here's a way to frame it in a maybe more abstract way. And one reason we want to do that is to take into account the good and the bad, and to be neutral in our approach to Bitcoin, trying to abstract away from our own biases. So here's a question that can help us do that. Suppose that when you woke up tomorrow, you didn't know who you'd be. You could be anybody of the 8 billion people alive. You could be Michael Saylor. You could be Vladimir Putin. You could be me. You could be you. You could be Roya. You could be one of the 2 billion people who suffer under bad or gross or even hyperinflation. You could be one of the 3 or 4 billion people who suffer under authoritarian rule. So let's say you just don't know who you'd be, and then you ask this question. When I wake up, do I want to wake up in a world with Bitcoin or without? Now, plainly, some of the people that you could turn out to be are harmed by Bitcoin. Jamie Dimon, for example, is probably harmed by Bitcoin, CEO of JP Morgan. His life is probably not made better by Bitcoin and maybe made worse in some ways because it's a competitor for the products that he offers. So if you woke up to be Jamie Dimon, you probably wouldn't want there to be Bitcoin. But that's not the question. The question isn't whether Jamie Dimon wants there to be Bitcoin. It's whether if you didn't know who you'd be. So think of it this way. There's a significant risk for you that you'll be one of the half of the people globally who suffer under authoritarian rule, or one of the billions who suffer under hyperinflation. You could be somebody like Roya. Now, if that's right, we think this motivates you to be happy that there is Bitcoin in the world, even if it doesn't benefit you. As a matter of fact, you should still rejoice that it benefits those people you might be when you wake up. And so then that's the thought experiment. Now step away from the thought experiment. It kind of transforms your own feelings about Bitcoin too. And you start to see it from someone else's perspective. That's the goal, at least. That's the perspective we want to shift here.
That gives me a couple of thoughts. Purely from, and I'm going to just completely generalize this and
go off, King. I want to hear you riff.
But if that's really compelling, because let's say, so it's for anybody who's not an authoritarian, let's just say. And if you say the percent of authoritarians in the world is the top 1%, let's just say 5%, it doesn't matter. Then that kind of leads to 95% of the world would benefit from Bitcoin if they woke up in that instance. And I believe you're talking about the behind the veil section of the book.
That's right.
Yeah. So just by pure mathematics, Bitcoin is maybe not for everyone, but for most everyone. And the other thought I had is that there's a lot on censorship. Bitcoin definitely is, censorship resistant. And it seems like authoritarians love censorship. That's their main tool. You don't see a lot of people on the low rungs of the socio-political ladder or whatever using censorship. They don't need to. It's usually a tool only used by that top percent of authoritarians. Do you jive with that? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So if you woke up to be Vladimir Putin, you might not want there to be Bitcoin. Exactly. But you only have a 1 out of 8 billion chance of being him. So in terms of risk aversion, if you're kind of taking a gamble on which person you'll be, you want to minimize the downsides that are possible. And you do that by opting for a world with Bitcoin rather than without.
Hey y'all, are you new to Bitcoin? You looking for a way to safely and securely store your Bitcoin? Check out the Bitcoin Advisors. These Bitcoiners are professionals that will provide you peace of mind so you can sleep soundly at night knowing your Bitcoin is safe. Remember to tell them Zoom Out sent you.
So I'm fairly certain that if I were to have the 3 of you authors in a room and I were to sit down and say the following sentence, that you would probably all 3 kind of shy away from it.
That sounds fun.
Bitcoin fixes this. Now,
it depends on the this, doesn't it, Tim? What does, is the this?
But so again, the definition of words here. That's a very common statement that's been used in Bitcoin, and I've used it many times. And I've been trying to, you're right, it does matter what you're talking about this, but I tend to change it, and I use the phrase Bitcoin incentivizes this. So, for example, it's a tool, and it's a tool. If we just focus in on time preference, for example, the tool that I'm currently using, or that we're currently using, the dollar, is not a good tool to live in a low time preference mindset. Through inflation, you're forced to always be in the here and now trying to run the rat race. Whereas we could elaborate on that, but just generally speaking, Bitcoin, with a scarcity aspect, you're more likely to be able to take a longer view of what you want out of life. And this is an N of one kind of thing. I've personally noticed that my time preference has changed dramatically since being in Bitcoin. So did it fix it? Well, maybe not, but I think I'm incentivized to live in a low time preference mindset, having at least studied it, not to mention living in Bitcoin. Thoughts on that?
I have two. One, I think what's at stake here might not actually be a shifting time preference, but rather the availability of an effective tool to make good on the preference you already have. So there's this idea about shifting whether you discount for time and changing how much you discount or not future goods. I suspect that Bitcoin doesn't actually do that. It doesn't change whether you discount the future. It instead changes your ability, if it works as the proponents say it does, at least, to make good on the preference you have to have goods in the future. So that's maybe a technical distinction. The second one is a bit more speculative, or let's just say forward-looking, and maybe more of a question. I think of this as in part an empirical question. We can't tell just by sitting around and guessing and thinking about it like philosophers do whether this is true, whether Bitcoin changes people's time preferences, makes them more patient, or makes them more able to enjoy a low time preference lifestyle. That is an empirical question about human psychology. So one thing I'd love to see is for academic psychologists to study this more carefully themselves, to think about, and there are tests, there are standard inventories for behavior, for subject responses to questions, and so on, and administer these tests over time for people. And the treatment is having Bitcoin or being involved in Bitcoin in some way. You can use different treatments, different ways of having the Bitcoin intervene in somebody's life, and see if this is actually true. And I think of that as an open research question, not to be settled by two guys on a podcast guessing or even speculating about the contents of their own heart or their own life, but instead trying to gather statistical evidence from actually looking at behavior, especially. So I would love to see this studied more carefully. And one of the goals of the book, if I may, is to just pry open this idea that Bitcoin's a respectable topic of study. And we're doing that within our own fields, philosophy and its intersection with economics and computer science. But we're hoping to make room for others as well, including other social scientists, psychologists, sociologists, and so on.
I'm interested, anecdotally speaking, did you notice any change since being in Bitcoin, personally speaking?
Here's a question that I didn't ask before, but now ask now, which is, when you're thinking about buying something, would I rather have this or would I rather stack some more sats? And that is the embodiment of the present manifestation of the anticipated future value. So I think to some extent, at least, yes, it looks like that to me.
So the sell your chairs meme is an actual philosophical discussion.
Maybe so, but as you can see, I'm sitting in a chair. As you can see, I'm sitting in my home studio. I have guitars behind me. I have a keyboard in front of me. This is money that I spent in 2019 putting this together that I could have been buying Bitcoins with. I didn't. And honestly, Tim, no regrets.
Yeah, no.
This is maybe a place where I disagree with some Bitcoiners who judge people for buying non-Bitcoin things. No, money is for buying stuff. It's good. If you want something and you need it and you have the money to buy it, go ahead, buy it. Buy your piano, buy your guitars.
Well, and as a musician myself, that is one of the best uses of time. And I find myself actually being able to enjoy the music playing, the music creating process way more. I don't know if it's just that I'm older and I'm hopefully a little more wiser, but yeah, I support that 100%.
You know, material goods can't make you happy, but if there are exceptions to that, they might be musical instruments. They are sources of great joy if you actually use them. That's my experience.
And as we've learned from 80s hair bands, guitars can be used for making music and also for bashing over amps and the
That's
like.
right.
So
well, there's that guy who had the sticker on his guitar that said, "This machine kills fascists." I think of that as being the sticker that should be on every Bitcoin node. It should have a little sticker that says, "This machine kills fascists." Just like the rock guitarist and the punk guitarist did.
Oh, I love it. So to take us back into, let's go back into the book. You spent a couple chapters on energy, which is a huge topic, and it's still, it's starting to gain traction that, energy consumption is good. Bitcoin using energy is not bad. And the two chapters I'm talking about are security through energy and the price of energy. Can you help the listener kind of understand the basic premise of these?
One thing that's important is to understand why Bitcoin uses energy in the first place. And that's the main goal, or one main goal of Chapter 9, Security Through Energy. It's explaining that every monetary system needs to achieve security on at least 3 dimensions before people are willing to use it, to trust their value to that system and to receive payments in it, or to give payments in it, or to store value in it. So think about how gold protects against forgery or counterfeiting. How do you know that gold isn't counterfeit? Well, it's physics that does that, because it's really hard to make gold. Alchemy, so far as we know, is not possible, at least at any scale, and not economical, even if it were possible. And it's physics that also prevents gold from being falsely spent, from spending gold that's not your own. Why? Because the gold that's not your own is in somebody else's pocket. That coin is over there rather than in your possession. And there's another curious property that we want money to have to be secure, which is that it can't be double spent. It can't be spent twice over. And again, physics is what protects gold here, because once I've given you that gold coin and you put it in your fanny pack, I don't have it still in my possession to spend to someone else. So let's think to the dollar digital system, the bank balances that we know well, which are digital, not physical, not like gold. How do these protect against those? How do they provide those kinds of monetary security? Well, counterfeiting is protected against via a system of trusted parties. It's a trusted network of banks. And you can't make new dollars unless you're deputized by the Fed to do so. And you have to have your books available for auditing. And if you create new dollars in contravening the rules, you'll be audited and discovered and thrown into jail. You can't double spend, because there are rules governing these databases that mean that once you've depleted a balance on one account and deposited it somewhere else, you can't do it again. That balance is now 0. And these things are supposed to balance out in that way.
Right.
And then false spending, you can't spend somebody else's digital dollars because you don't have the password to their bank account, and that's protected by a trusted party again. So that's, and let's notice that there are enormous resources used to provide security for this monetary system. Think about how many security officers and cybersecurity warriors and physical security systems and audits and accountants and regulators and Secret Service agents and Fed regulators and state bank charter regulators and so on govern this whole system.
You might have been throwing national defense.
That's right. That's right. So enormous amounts of energy are expended to provide that system. It's security. Bitcoin works very differently. Let's think about first counterfeiting. How do we protect against counterfeit Bitcoin? When you receive a Bitcoin transaction, how do you know that it's not fake? Well, this is actually super cheap. You just run a node and your node can verify it. And the marginal cost of verification is close to 0. You've already got your node running. A transaction comes in and it automatically checks. And if it shows up and your Bitcoin balance goes up, then that's basically your node telling you, yeah, I checked the signatures, the cryptographic signatures on it. It's legit. It's in the blockchain. It's in the chain with the longest work. It's been added by miners to the network. You're good. This is real. So that's super, super cheap and doesn't require cybersecurity warriors. It doesn't require auditors and an army of bankers and regulators and so on. So that's counterfeiting. Similarly, false spending is protected against in the same way. How do you prevent somebody from spending your Bitcoins? Well, keep your keys private, dude. Don't show someone else your private keys and they cannot spend your Bitcoins. Now, that puts the onus not on the banking system, but on the user. But again, the cost here is actually quite low. At least it can be.
And I would,
you might spend more on security there.
If I can pause real quick, back to incentivizing. I think that's a net positive long term, because if self-sovereignty is a muscle, you're forced to flex that muscle. And the more self-sovereign a society is, you would think the more robust or anti-fragile it might be. I don't know if I'm going off on a tangent here, but please continue.
That is an intriguing thought. Let me finish this bit on the security of Bitcoin, because now we're at that third part, which was super simple for the traditional banking system, but actually kind of weird and complicated for Bitcoin. How does Bitcoin prevent against or provide security against double spending? So notice that the security budget for Bitcoin is super cheap for the other two, and it's imposed only on users. That is against counterfeiting and false spending. But when it comes to double spending, that's what mining does. And the fundamental dynamic here for mining preventing double spending is that it's expensive and requires the expenditure of energy in particular to create new blocks, to publish new collections of transactions to the Bitcoin network. And if you want to double spend, you have to create new blocks yourself. So it's expensive to double spend. So what was in some ways cheap for the banking network to protect against, because they just need to make sure that this balance over here, once spent, reads zero, can't be spent again. That's a simple equation that can do that, or a little check. It's 2 lines of code. Bitcoin does something rather complicated, but it does this without trusted parties. So for the price of energy, you purchase security. And of course, it comes at a price, but what you get is security without trusted third parties and their possible failures. And so that's the fundamental bargain that Bitcoiners make. And it's not Bitcoin that spends this energy. It's Bitcoiners who buy the energy. We pay miners to protect our network. We pay them by buying Bitcoins when they dump their Bitcoins in the market and we buy them from them. We're paying them. We pay them when we put transaction fees in our transactions. We pay them when we hold Bitcoin. And even though they're diluting the supply by creating new Bitcoins, which they mint every 10 minutes in a new block, and we still hold our Bitcoin. So that's how we pay miners. So then the question framed this way is not why does Bitcoin use so much energy? It's why do Bitcoiners buy so much energy? And the answer is that we think it's worth it because we want security without trusted third parties. Now, there are a lot of uses of energy that people complain about. Think about a mosque. Have you ever been in a mosque, Tim?
I have not.
Here's what you'll see. Lots of ornate patterns because they're not allowed to have depictions of Allah or the Prophet, peace be upon him. So they have tile patterns and they're really ornate and complicated and they take forever to make. Enormous expenditures of human creativity and energy go into putting these little tiles into place. Now you might look at that and start to judge like, wait a minute, why are you using so much energy on this? Isn't that wasteful? And I think in a free society, we say, no, if you want to spend money on energy, if you think it's worthwhile, you should get to do so, as long as you're not harming somebody else. So that's chapter 9. But then we come to this big question. Well, what if you are harming someone else? What if there are carbon emissions associated with energy production? And that's the second big question, and that's chapter 10. Tim, I lost your audio there.
There we are. That gave me 2 thoughts. First things first, the phrase, there are no solutions, only trade-offs, which I absolutely love that phrase because that's where reality is. And I'm not trying to open up a can of worms here, but it really what you just said gave me shades of Jason Lowery's software in a way, where it's, for lack of a better term, he used power projection to protect property rights, if I just said it in a very short phrase. But that's the trade-off. We choose to use energy to protect our digital property rights.
Yeah, in this case, to protect them against double spending. So it's not protection in the sense of keeping somebody from taking what's yours. It's that they can't double spend what is their own. So that's what mining is.
That's an important distinction, yes.
So that's one area where I actually disagree with Jason. I think he misidentifies what all that massive energy expenditure does. I don't think it protects property rights. It's digital signatures that protect property rights. Bitcoin mining doesn't do that. Instead, it protects against double spending, which doesn't have anything to do with spending your Bitcoin. When you double spend, you're spending your own Bitcoin. You're just doing it twice. So that's not protection of property rights. It's a different kind of security.
I see that. That makes sense. Again, the meaning of words. Just as society,
I'm sorry. I'm a philosopher, so I'll be pedantic about this.
No, I love it because it's so in society it's so easy to just throw out just a string of words, just and without that check, that pause to say, is this what I'm actually saying, or is this what I'm actually meaning? The thing about philosophy is it's definitely a marathon, not a sprint. You have to be willing to take that time and put in that effort to really get anything out of it. Whew. Okay. So I need to pause and reset. So
I'll take a sip of water while we're at it too.
Please. You mentioned earlier about the need to open up different avenues of research in terms of like, does the Bitcoin fixes this, incentivizes this, like socially speaking. I've seen, for lack of a better word, tweets showing the cost of securing the ledger, or however you want to say that, to double spending versus the traditional financial system. And it's just a very simple bar graph, like this much versus this much. Have you ever come across any real studies, like legitimate studies, that compare the cost of Bitcoin versus the cost of the traditional financial system?
We tried to do one of our own in an early draft of what became chapters 9 and 10.
Love it.
And we were cautioned by early readers against doing this, and we cut all of that from the book. And here's why. What I had done, I'd written that section, I had gone through and thought of everything that I could conceive of that protected digital dollars from double spending, false spending, or counterfeit spending, and thought of all the government budgetary offices at the state and federal level, and tried to think about how to apportion this, and came up with some napkin math about the total value protected, which would be basically M1 or M2, one of these aggregate money numbers, and then how much is spent per year. So you have a rate. It's the amount protected, and then how much is spent per year. And then that's like a fee, a security fee for the network.
Sure.
But it was pointed out to us that we might have both overcounted and undercounted the expenses here. Overcounted because sometimes some of this is overlapping. And so, for example, there's the Treasury paying the Fed, or the Fed paying the Treasury. So it's hard to get the accounting right there. And some of these agencies do lots of other stuff too, and they don't disaggregate it in their budgets. So really hard to actually be clear about this. Now, here's where Bitcoin is different. We know what the upper bound of Bitcoin's security budget is. It's how much miners get in revenue. They're not spending more than they get in revenue.
No.
So what they get in revenue every year is the upper bound of the double spending security expenditure. So Bitcoin is in that way a far more transparent security model. And that, I think, is why people are able to make these charts that make Bitcoin look bad, is because you can run the numbers really easily on Bitcoin. You just look at miner revenue for a year, and that's how much was spent to protect against double spending. We know that. That's at least the upper bound. We don't know what that is for traditional fiat systems. So I view this as another open research question that I'd like to pursue further. Yeah. And I have a co-author in mind who said he's got some ideas too. So maybe next year we'll dig into that. Right now it's in the scrap pile from the book, though.
I would love to see that. And aside from what others said to take it out, you can just start with the idea that everything on this side, on the traditional fiat side, it's like the Wizard of Oz, like pay no attention to the man behind. You can't get at the actual number. This is the best representation because, like you mentioned, it's not transparent. And that in and of itself is a problem that people should be looking at. Okay, so I want to throw a thought experiment at you and let you jam on it, please.
Please.
This is what I came from as I finished History Echoes Bitcoin. The thought experiment.
He's talking about this book right here. I'm holding it up.
Oh, my man.
Tim's book.
My man. Full disclosure, I paid him a bunch of money to do that, so let's just go ahead and put that out. But thank
3 Bitcoins, I believe, was my fee. 3 Bitcoins.
And
what was it for? Is that what we said?
I think I'll see you in 40 years. Yes, and I'll be able to pay. Here's the thought experiment. I just want you to just jam on it. Pretend there's no price to Bitcoin. It's a static price. You still have the ability to choose and interact between the fiat network and the Bitcoin network. Which one would you choose? In fiat, you're choosing a permission system, a centralized system. It's highly censored. It's closed source. It's mutable. It requires trust and has an unlimited and erratic supply. On the other side, you have Bitcoin, which is permissionless, decentralized, censorship resistant, open source, immutable, trustless, and programmatically scarce in supply.
What you're imagining, if I understand it right, is Bitcoin, but where the native asset is something like a stable coin. Is that right?
I didn't presuppose any of that. What I was just trying to do was abstract away the price and take the exchange rate out of the conversation. And the reason I did that is because the majority of the world, when you say, what's Bitcoin? What do they know? They're looking at the ticker on the bottom of the screen. Right. That's what they see. And part of my reason was to try and let them know, hey, it's not that. It's not just that. But the other part was to say, let's just it's a tool on its merit, or I guess it's more of a preference thing. But
so you're describing all of the benefits of the tool and asking me to abstract away from what is widely thought to be one of the costs of the tool. And put that way, and say, of course, let's use it. Now, sure. Here's that's a kind of maybe an annoying way of responding to the thought experiment.
I get it. That makes sense.
But here's maybe one thing to notice. Once you see that people actually want those properties and those properties are good for at least many people, maybe not all, but for many, sure. That actually gives you reason to think that there will be a price because people will want something that can do that. And that means they'll give something of value for it, which means it has a price, provided that there's some scarcity.
And to me, the price is a reflection of people, maybe not everybody wanting there. I'm sure there's a lot of people who just buy it, number go up. That's why I started in the first place, came for the NGU, stayed for the revolution kind of thing. But right. I think the longer term value proposition lies in those properties. And then the more people are able to see those properties for what they are, if you could just pause on the price for a second and see there's other value outside of this number, then it might give them a better understanding of the asset, of the network. Not the asset,
I agree.
Of the network.
There's one critique of Bitcoin that I think is both right and wrong. This critique says that Bitcoin, and its price in particular, is just a Keynesian beauty contest, where the only thing that determines the price is whether other people want it. So how much should I want it? Well, I'm predicting or guessing how much other people will want it. So it's sort of everybody looking at each other trying to figure out if they want it. There's something right about this because, well, Bitcoin's price is a function purely of its demand, not of its supply, because the supply is fixed, known in advance, programmatically set, unlikely to be changed. So that's what's right about it. But what's wrong is it ignores why people, at least some people, might want it for fundamental reasons, which is reasons not just about others, but reasons of usefulness. Bitcoin is a tool that can be used in ways that other monetary tools can't. You can transact without the permission of third parties. You can give somebody value without the permission of a would-be censor. And that's what the critique misses, is that, yes, this is purely a function of demand, but somebody might have reasons for demand that pertain to usefulness, which itself is a function of demand as well. So these are all intertwined and entangled, but there's something about usefulness at the heart of this that gets ignored by that kind of critique. I actually wrote a paper about this. It's called Digital Value. The question is just, why is Bitcoin valuable? And the answer I give in the end is because it's useful. It's a one-line question and a one-line answer, but surprisingly complicated, and people say some very foolish things along the way, in my opinion. So I tried to show why they were wrong and why it's actually quite a simple question to answer.
And I see the link here. It's on your andrewmbailey.com website.
Yes, it's freely available.
So then you would be in the camp of value is subjective, correct?
Economic value of this kind, yes.
Awesome.
I think there are other values that are not subjective. So I think murder is disvaluable, and that's not a matter of opinion. It's just true that murder is disvaluable. Even if you find it valuable, you're actually wrong about that. But that's moral value, not economic value.
Again, going back to the definition of words, like I have all these phrases and things that have amassed through my life, and it's just like, yeah, that might be right, but only in this one very small component.
Well, the phrase you gave is often repeated by Austrian economists. Value is subjective. And I think they sometimes take that phrase from economics and apply it outside of economics, and that's where I think they make a mistake. It should be economic value is subjective, where economic value is a matter of price.
Okay, so I want to wrap up with one question, and this might be silly.
Let's do it.
We know, as we've said, philosophy is kind of like that marathon. It's like you have to be slow, you have to be thoughtful, and you have to be willing to proof of work, so to speak. Has anybody ever asked you to give an elevator speech? Like you're literally on an elevator, you got 30 seconds. Somebody sees you holding your book, and they say, "What is Bitcoin?" You only got 30 seconds. Is that something you think you can knock off?
Shall I try?
I'd love it.
We live in an increasingly digital world, and people can use computers to surveil and control others. One site where they do that is money. They can block your transactions, your ability to send or receive value. Bitcoin is a way to fight back. It's a way to resist. And that's why we call Bitcoin resistance money. And we think that the world is better to have resistance money in it than not.
That was 25 seconds. That's amazing.
Okay, great.
Dude, we got that recorded, so I'm just gonna anytime I'm in an elevator, I'm just gonna be like, here you go. Just listen to this. I love it. Andrew.
Thanks, man.
Gosh, this has been an amazing conversation. I love talking and I love thinking like this, and I don't do it enough. And reading your book and talking to you makes me want to do more of it. So I hope I hope everybody who's watching and listening, they feel the same way. Guys, go out, get resistance money, read it, take the time, put in the work. Gosh, Andrew Bailey, where else can we send people?
The book's website is easy. It's resistance.money. And you can also find 20 plus articles that my co-authors and I have put out over the last couple of years, dozens of podcasts and more. And we encourage you to read the book and then talk to us about it. You can find us on Twitter. Our handles are on the book website. You can find us easily enough. We'd love to hear people's reactions and critiques. We've already found a couple of spelling errors. There are probably more egregious mistakes that we've made too. So send it to us so we can fix it in the next edition. But we'd love to hear what the world has to say about this book.
Andrew Bailey, thank you for joining me on Zoom Out.
Thank you, Tim. A pleasure. You should also